Now, I know what you're saying. You're going, come on, Mason. Another running back strategy video, another league-winning running back video. I've seen a million of these by now. Well, I don't think you've seen one with this much historical research that's gone into it. I've been pouring into these numbers over the past week, trying to get you the most predictive measures on how we can attack the running back position going forward by looking at data that we've had since the year 2000. So let's go ahead and let's outline this. What I've tracked since year 2000 is going to be all elite level running back finishes. Now, of course, this isn't just an elite level running back because on this list, you'll have a couple guys that pop up multiple times, right? I mean, LaDainian Tomlinson pops up multiple times. Adrian Peterson here multiple times. Christian McCaffrey here multiple times. Priest Holmes here multiple times. So we are going to go ahead and look at all these elite running back finishes where you have seen them average at least 22 points per game in a full PPR format in that season, while at the same time playing a minimum of 12 games. I want to look at what age were they in that season. I want to look at what was their receiving down usage the year prior. What was their rushing down usage the year prior? And we can see, what does a typical guy look like? How can we use this to get better information on who should we draft this year? And then also dive into the outliers and see if they're going to be predictive going forward as well. So we gathered all this data, and the first thing that I wanted to break down was going to be the age of these RBs. So if you're looking at these elite level running back seasons, you had 4 running backs 22 years old, you had 7 running backs that were 23, you had 5 running backs that were 24, 8 running backs that were 25, 4 that were 26, 6 that were 27, 4 that were 28, 3 that were 29, and 2 that were 30. So you really get a sense, I mean, you're going to have just a random scatter plot of these running back finishes when it comes to their age outside of when we get to 28 years old. I mean, these running backs, you can see the elite level ceiling at 27, and then 28, it becomes harder and harder and harder for them to actually be elite. Now, of course, there were instances, and I want to dive into what those running backs look like because we have a couple 28, 29, 30-year-old running backs that people are very excited about in fantasy this year. And going back to 2001, this will be the first guy that you had at 29 years old that was actually, I mean, a great option in fantasy. You had Priest Holmes, and if you look at the season before his age 29 season, the year 2000, he actually had 21 points per game. He played 16 games the year prior. He had a target share number of 15%. He had a rushing share number of 73%, and he averaged 97 rushing yards per game and 38 receiving yards per game. So Priest Holmes, I mean, was elite, and I mean elite the year before. He's a top 3 running back already. You actually saw him do this in his age 30 season as well in the year 2002, where his prior season, he was 31.6 points per game. So, I mean, you can see that you have the elite level finishes from these older running backs if they are the top, and I mean the top of the game. Now, you move beyond this, you had Tiki Barber actually doing this in 2004 and 2005 as well. And what's very interesting is in both those seasons, he was also just a straight up monster workhorse. He had a 16 and a 17% team target share. He also had a rushing yard mark at 95 and 76 yards in those 2 seasons, and a receiving yardage mark of 36 and 29 receiving yards. And of course, these are the seasons prior. So we're trying to predict that elite level winning season. And we also had Matt Forte in 2014, where the year prior, he averaged 37 receiving yards per game and 83 rushing yards per game. So we've had 5 instances since the year 2000 where you had these running backs that were 29, 30 years old, still being elite in fantasy football. And in those 5 instances, all these guys were the cream of the crop. All these guys were true elite level workhorses. It's not like they were just great rushing the ball. It's not like they were just great catching the ball. You had to do everything if you were going to overcome that age. Now, going over to running backs that really didn't have a role as a rusher the year prior. I know that sounds weird, but they averaged less than 60 rushing yards per game. You're going to see a decent amount of names on this list, right? I mean, David Johnson, the year before he broke out, averaged fewer than 60 yards per game. Same thing with Todd Gurley, Alvin Kamara, Christian McCaffrey, and Kamara did it a couple times. Eckler's in here, and Brian Westbrook as well. Now, the main thing that I need to be pointing out is when these running backs turn into elite level options, even if they weren't phenomenal as a rusher the year prior, what they were is they were elite catching the football. I mean, you're going to go ahead and look at guys like Alvin Kamara, 51 receiving yards per game before he truly breaks out. Austin Eckler there, 40 receiving yards per game. Brian Westbrook, 51 receiving yards per game. On average, these guys are about 35, 40 receiving yards per game before their elite level ceiling. And then all of a sudden, if they get that extra usage as a rusher, then that's what makes them the cream of the crop in fantasy. Now, also, what's going to be noteworthy and pointing out is you had no running backs that were breaking out at this point as a rusher at 28 years old or older. They had to be young for these breakouts. You had Todd Gurley, 23 years old. You had CMC, 22. You had, Alvin Kamara, 23. You're looking at guys that were 27 years old or younger here. Now, receiving, you're going to see something similar in that you don't really have, any running backs that break out without the receiving down skill set. There were only 3 running backs before their elite level season that averaged fewer than 15 receiving yards per game. There are only 5 running backs that averaged fewer than 20 receiving yards per game the year before their elite level breakout. Now, with these names, no surprise to anybody, what you ended up having is you had running backs that were phenomenal on first and second down. You had Jamal Charles, Jonathan Taylor, Chris Johnson, Adrian Peterson, as well as Sean Alexander. So what we are getting a sense of with all these different metrics is you're getting a sense of a running back can be old, but if he's old, he better be a true 3-down workhorse. A running back may not have a ton of rushing volume, but if he doesn't, he needs to be young and he needs to be an elite level receiver. And a running back may not have a crazy receiving yardage mark, but what he needs to be is he needs to be young and he needs to be a phenomenal rusher. Now, with all this being said, you don't have a running back that is having 2 red boxes on his profile. It doesn't happen. You can have 1 red box. You can say, well, overlook this one warning, this one thing with this running back because everything else is elite if you want him to be phenomenal in fantasy. So if we go over and we look at where these guys are being drafted this year and try to identify maybe how we can use this information for these RBs, round 1, you're looking at Christian McCaffrey, and CMC is fine across the board. Christian McCaffrey is a phenomenal rusher. He averaged 68 rushing yards per game this past season. Obviously, we know he's an elite level receiver. He was at 44 receiving yards per game. And at the same time, Christian McCaffrey is only 27 years old. He's not 28. He's not 29. He's not 30. You don't really have to worry about that. And of course, I'm a little bit biased when it comes to Christian McCaffrey. He won me the $100,000 Big Dog tournament on Underdog last year. He also won me the $20,000 Bulldog 2 tournament on Underdog. So I love my guy. And of course, if y'all want to draft with us in one of those Underdog tournaments, I am drafting every single night on the live stream on Underdog. And if you sign up to Underdog with the link in the description, comment section, or live chat, they're going to match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. Plus, you're going to get our 2023 fantasy football rankings, a free trial to flockfantasy.com, where you can find our 2023 fantasy football draft guide. It's best ball, so no time commitment at all during the year. So I drafted 700 teams, won $150,000 on Underdog last season. And also Underdogs, where you have all the pick'em lines that you see in our videos. My favorite pick'em line right now is going to be Jordan Love for fewer than 13.5 interceptions. But nonetheless, Christian McCaffrey looks like he has access to an elite level ceiling with not too many red flags that you can draft in round 1 this season. Now, going over to Austin Eckler, on the other hand, Eckler maybe doesn't fit that same mold, right? Austin Eckler is going to be 28 years old this season. Historically speaking, this is about where you see the running back fall-offs happen. But what do we know about these older running backs, right? You can be 28, you can be 29, you can be 30 years old, as long as you are a true workhorse running back and you are going to see that Priest Holmes level workload, right? You're going to go out there and you're going to get 20 carries a game and 5 targets a game out of this backfield. Now, with Eckler, he also has another red flag. Eckler's not really used as a rusher. Eckler only averaged 55.1 rushing yards per game this past season. Now, of course, he's scored a ridiculous amount of touchdowns over the past 2 seasons. But if we look at this profile and combine the fact that at the end of the day, you may be in a spot where a healthy Mike Williams, a healthy Keenan Allen, and now an added on Quentin Johnston, they don't have to use Eckler as much as a pass catcher. I'm not a big Eckler guy. It's why I'm actually drafting Bijan Robinson instead in round 1 this season. Now, going over to our next guy, we have Nick Chubb. Now, Nick Chubb actually has a couple red flags here as well, right? Nick Chubb, 28 years old, not the end of the world, as long as you are that true 3-down workhorse. As long as you're going to go out there and have the receiving down role, the rushing role, and that's not the case with Chubb. Last year, 12.1 receiving yards per game. Now, of course, this may go up because you have no Kareem Hunt in Cleveland this next season. But at the end of the day, I mean, I'm a little bit worried if you're looking at his underdog draft cost in particular, where you're seeing him go before someone like Saquon Barkley, for instance. Because if we pivot over to Saquon Barkley is 26, right in the sweet spot for his age this next year. I mean, this is a running back that averaged 82 rushing yards per game as well as 21.1 receiving yards per game. You have no red flags with Saquon Barkley across the board. And our next guy, you don't really have too many red flags with either in Tony Pollard. What's very interesting is if you're going to be looking at Tony Pollard, this is a running back that, I mean, is, in my mind, one of the most polarizing players in fantasy football right now. Personally, I have not drafted a lot of Tony Pollard this year, and I have been on record saying that if the Dallas Cowboys do not bring in another running back, Tony Pollard looks like he can be that league winner, and Tony Pollard looks like he can crush me. Right now, I'm a little bit worried about Dalvin, Kareem Hunt, Leonard Fournette, Ezekiel Elliott, Jonathan Taylor, any of those names possibly going over to the Dallas Cowboys and turning this back into a committee. But nonetheless, on the paper, looks like Pollard is a league winner this next season. Now, going over to our next guy, Derrick Henry, 29 years old. Now, with Henry, you can maybe make an argument, well, Mason, the age is there, but come on, look at the usage. Henry averaged 25.3 receiving yards per game this past season. That's legitimately more than what you had with Saquon Barkley this past year. He's getting used as a pass catcher. We obviously know his talent as a rusher. I'm a little bit worried. He turns 30 in January. On top of this with Derrick Henry, what I'm more so worried about is the fact that he projects to have the worst offensive line in the NFL at the same time. I know we've said this time and time again, and I know you're probably tired of hearing me say it by now, but you need to be drafting Derrick Henry as much as you can in underdog drafts at the very end of round 2, in the beginning of round 3 in a half PPR format. I think that is a fine price point for Derrick Henry, given the profile that he has associated with the risk as well as the upside. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're going to look at where he is in a regular ESPN draft, where there he's going round 1, there he's going, 5 picks ahead of Nick Chubb. It's going to be a little bit more difficult for me to take Derrick Henry at that price tag, considering the red flags. Now, our next guy with JT only has one red flag. The receiving down usage wasn't there this past year. Now, 2 years ago, it was. Obviously, with Taylor, this is a running back that has an extremely wide range of outcomes as well, in that we really don't know where he's going to be playing this next year. We don't know if he's healthy. There's just so much uncertainty. I would say it's definitely a player that you do not want to take round 1 in your regular redraft league this year. Now, if you're in an underdog tournament, right, where say you're in Best Ball Mania, it's a $25 buy-in, $3 million for first place. Trust me, I'm drafting the hell out of Jonathan Taylor there in rounds 2 and 3, just because, we are shooting for the absolute moon in those underdog drafts. Now, going over to our next guy, Josh Jacobs checks every single box. Jacobs has no red flags, right? 25 years old. 100 rushing yards per game this past year, about 25 receiving yards per game this past season. The real question is Josh Jacobs going to play? We know the volume's there. We know he's in his prime spot with age. Breece Hall, he's good to go. 22 years old. Breece Hall, averaged 66 rushing yards per game this past season, 31 receiving yards per game. With all, the real question is he healthy, right? And honestly, do they bring in Dalvin Cook? Now, our next guy, Najee Harris, Travis Etienne, we can throw him in the same bucket. Travis Etienne, 18.6 receiving yards per game. Sadly, barely misses the cutoff that we are looking for. With that being said, Najee Harris is a little bit more concerning because Najee Harris misses the cutoff both as a receiver as well as a rusher. And at the same time, Travis Etienne is in a much better offense than Najee Harris. So personally, I'm going to be taking Travis Etienne over Najee Harris, even though in those underdog drafts, you have Najee Harris with a higher ADP than Etienne. Now, going over to our next guy, Joe Mixon, doesn't really check any of these boxes in terms of red flags. He's good to go across the board. 27 years old, had the usage as a rusher, had the usage as a pass catcher this past year, plus an elite level offense. I think Mixon's completely fine round 4 year draft. Aaron Jones is someone that I've been fading as of late. Aaron Jones is most likely going to be on a bad team this next year. Aaron Jones is 29 years old, and the usage for Aaron Jones has trended in the negative direction as of late. It's a running back that I'm not in love with at his current price point. Now, Kenneth Walker, our next guy, I mean, he's only 23, but really not as involved as a pass catcher as you would like to see last season. And as you're going to see, as we get further down fantasy boards, there are going to be more and more red flags popping up where it's going to be very hard to find a quote-unquote league-winning running back. Miles Sanders only averaged 4.9 receiving yards per game this past season. Cam Akers didn't have the volume that you wanted to see, neither as a rusher or a receiver. Plus, Akers behind a horrendous offensive line, probably on a bad team as well. Not too excited about Akers. Dameon Pierce didn't really have the involvement you wanted to see as a receiver this past season, 12.7 yards per game. J.K. Dobbins only at 5.2 receiving yards per game this past season. I mean, there's a massive red flag on his front. David Montgomery doesn't have any red flags. David Montgomery kind of checks every single box. And if you're looking at underdog best ball drafts where you don't have to submit your starting lineup on a week-to-week basis, I actually do not mind David Montgomery at all at his current price, going at pick 77, going right behind guys like Jahan Dotson and then a couple tight ends. I'm actually fine taking David Montgomery, just given the touchdown access he has in that Detroit Lions offense behind an elite offensive line. Now, DeAndre Swift didn't have the involvement as a rusher. DeAndre Swift only at 39.8 rushing yards per game. James Conner is fine across the board, but he's a little bit on the older side, 28 years old, should be a horrendous offense this next season. And once we get older, right, what we want to see is we want to see that Priest-Holmes level workload. You need to be a true 3-down bell cow, averaging like 130 yards per game. James Conner barely crossed both our thresholds. Now, Rachaad White wasn't there as a rusher. He wasn't there as a receiver either. James Cook wasn't there as a rusher, wasn't there as a receiver. Alvin Kamara is a little bit on the older side, plus he doesn't check what you want to see as a rusher. Isaiah Pacheco wasn't there as a rusher or a receiver. I mean, Dalvin Cook is going to be on that older side, plus wasn't there as a receiver. And then you had Antonio Gibson, wasn't there as a rusher. Dylan, not there either. And then Brian Robinson only had 5 receiving yards per game this past season. Now, I understand everybody's initial reaction is going to be going, well, Mason, you don't understand. Their situation has changed. Mason, you understand. This isn't last year. But when we looked through historical data going back to the year 2000, we didn't really go, oh, okay, well, let's consider the fact that this running back changed teams. No, the numbers are the numbers. And we looked at all those outliers and said, to be an outlier, what were the other things that you needed to see? So on a recap, if you're going to be an outlier and you're going to be too old, you need to be elite. You need to be that Priest-Holmes guy going out there and averaging 31 points per game the year prior. If you're going to be an outlier with the rushing perspective, you need to be an elite level receiver and you need to be younger at the same time. And if you're going to be an outlier on the receiving end, you need to be an elite level rusher and you need to be younger at the same time. So you can't see 2 red flags. You can see 1 red flag if they're great everywhere else. But 2 red flags on the same player doesn't mean you can't draft them, just means they're probably not going to have access to a true league-winning season at 22 points per game or more this next year. But I hope this data helped you out. I hope you're able to get something from this. And as always, if you have not done so already, go down there, drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. And if you want to get into a fantasy football draft with me, which I'm doing every single night on this live stream, you can find that link to Underdog Fantasy in the comment section, in the description. Sign up to Underdog with promo code FLOCK, and they're going to match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. Plus, you're going to get our 2023 fantasy football rankings, a free trial to flockfantasy.com. And on top of that, that's where you can find our 2023 fantasy football draft guide. But thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. I really do appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day and really hope that we get to see you out with the live stream later tonight.